In class, we had been talking about Leonardo da Vinci's works and the changes to his approach to painting. We started with the portrait of Ginevra da Benci on your right, where we began to see him using the sfumato technique, this sort of hazy, smoky light that he writes about in his notebooks, and that he quite likes. A light that obscures as much as it reveals, where forms seem to emerge from the darkness, where borders between different forms that he paints are obscured in the darkness, in the haze. And this gets stronger later in his career, as we see with the Virgin of the Rocks on your left, which we stopped talking about in class. But we did mention, and it's important to reassert, how this idea that you can't really see the distinctions, but your mind sort of understands them, that you actually complete the picture within the viewer's mind. But this relates very, very closely to the ideas of Neoplatonism, where perfection only exists in the human mind and doesn't actually exist in the visible world. A little bit more about the context of the Virgin of the Rocks. In 1482, Leonardo da Vinci left his hometown of Florence for the city of Milan, as you can see here on the map, right at the foothills of the Alps in northern Italy. He stayed there for the next 18 years, 1482 all the way to 1498. And while he was there, he became a court painter to the Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza. And the Virgin of the Rocks was actually supported by Sforza. It was painted as the altarpiece for a religious order that Ludovico Sforza belonged to. And that helps us to understand the picture a bit. Not only do we understand why Leonardo made it, he made it for a group associated with his major patron, the Duke of Milan. But over and above that, this religious order, this confraternity that Sforza belonged to, was dedicated to the Virgin Mary, and in particular to the new theological idea that the Virgin Mary was herself born from a virgin, the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin, that in order to give birth to Christ who is sinless, the Virgin Mary had to be sinless as well. And this is a linchpin in Catholic thought these days, but it was a relatively new addition to Catholic theology in the 15th century. It was only a few decades old. And so this confraternity that commissioned this work from Leonardo was devoted to the idea of the Virgin's own Immaculate Conception, her own virgin birth. What's interesting is that Leonardo doesn't show us really that, but he doesn't really show us anything supernatural, anything immaculate, but rather he focuses on his own conception of nature. And I think that for Leonardo, this is the important part, that nature is the Immaculate Conception for him. The Virgin emerges from these primordial rocks just as she kind of comes out of the shadows, and that's his metaphor. That's his nature is his metaphor for perfection, for the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin out of the womb of St. Anne. And when Leonardo writes about nature, he almost always takes on this idea that nature is itself kind of quasi-religious. And I think that we're seeing that idea play out here. And as we think about how Leonardo views nature, he sees it as a power, as a force, as something that's always changing, always in flux, always growing before our eyes. And I think if you look at the landscape rocks in the background, there's that sense that it's just erupted into the light from beneath the earth, as if we're seeing nature in the moment of creation. And again, I think that's his metaphor for the Immaculate Conception. But as we think about nature as having power, as nature is always changing, one of the things that Leonardo seems to focus on is how everything in nature seems to resemble water. And we saw this in the art fix on the Mona Lisa, but we see it here in the robes as well, how they swirl and eddy and pool up and flow outward as if they were made of water. And I think this is the way that Leonardo shows us that nature is everything. That everything is basically flowing as if it were water. to show this ongoing development, change in nature. And Leonardo just loves studying water and seems to sort of almost conceptualize everything as if it were part of it. And to illustrate the point, here's one of his sketchbooks, which shows his studies of the flow of water diverted by planes flowing into a bowl. And I think you can see how, in many ways, the way in which the water flows around in the bowl here reminds us of how it seems to flow around the hip of the angel there, or how the rivulets of water that flow here are similar to the way in which parts of the drapery swirl and flow around the figure. Everything seems to be water for Leonardo. It's while working for the Duke of Milan that Leonardo paints his other work that everyone seems to be familiar with, the famous Last Supper fresco. This was again for a religious institution that was financially supported by Duke Ludovico Sforza. He kept a monastery in Milan, supported them monetarily so that they would pray for him. And we've seen this a couple times over. Remember, Cosimo de' Medici in Florence supported Fra Angelico's monastery, and then even earlier than that, Duke Philip the Good of Burgundy supported the monastery where Klaus Schluter worked. This was fairly common for court members to endow religious institutions, and this is the case in Milan as well, where Leonardo paints the Last Supper. In this particular case, Leonardo has decorated the room where the monks eat, called the refectory, and he's decorated with the scene that shows the most holy of meals. Here is that refectory, and you can see the fresco on the far wall that seems to naturally extend the space through his use of one-point perspective. This is where the monks would have eaten every day, and they do so in the presence of Christ. Most of the refectory has been rebuilt because it was very, very badly damaged during World War II. The Italians were our enemies. They sided with Hitler, and we bombed the heck out of this place. But we warned them ahead of time, and they sandbagged the wall so it was preserved. The painting appears to be a fresco, but remember that fresco describes in particular one kind of mural painting, and that is water-based paint in wet plaster. Leonardo thought he knew a better way, and he painted with egg tempera on top of dry plaster, which was a huge mistake. And almost all of the original paint has flaked away because it didn't bind with the lime in the wet plaster. And even by Vasari's time, remember our great historian Vasari writing in the 1550s, even at that point he said it was nothing more than a ghost of what it had once been. Here we can see some of that damage as we look closely at Christ in the center of the composition. This reveals to us the moment in the narrative that Leonardo has chosen. This is the exact moment where Christ tells the apostles, "One of you will betray me," and they are, of course, dumbfounded by this. And they ask him, "Lord, is it I? Which one of us will betray you?" So this is the moment when he's given that proclamation. Somebody at this table is going to turn me in to the Roman authorities. So they're all questioning now, which one of us? Leonardo focuses on that central proclamation, and then the 12 apostles reacting each in a different way, each saying, "Is it me?" Again, halos are not important to Leonardo. Supernatural elements are not important to Leonardo. It's very human, the reaction of each of these figures to the message. That said, he gives Christ sort of a natural halo. He places him in front of 3 windows, certainly a symbol for the Trinity, and the central window gives him a sort of natural highlight behind his head. And you'll notice that even up above at the top here, there's a lunette, a sort of semicircular architectural element that forms a halo as well around Christ's head. In fact, I think the epicenter of that circle, if you trace it out, would be the eye of Christ. Now, those windows that are behind Christ actually provide one of the keys to understanding the composition. You'll notice that there are 3 openings on the back window, and there are 4 openings on each side of the wall, and you'll see that those are, in fact, openings as we look more closely in detail. 3s and 4s are everywhere we look. The apostles, of course, are 12, 3 times 4. And you'll notice, as you look at the composition, that Leonardo breaks it into sort of 3 nice little groups of 4. A group here, 2 groups there, another group here, a 4th group there. So he's using parts of the composition to sort of tie it all together, right? And Christ sits in the center, almost like a triangle, making this message to his opponent. And again, to keep the focus on Christ, notice where he makes the vanishing point. It's the eye of Christ. Leonardo often said that nature was the eye of God. And I think that's something that seems to be playing out in this as well, that the eye of Christ is the focal point of this particular image. Now, the big question is, of course, where is the one who will betray us? Because the next moment of this, as they say, Lord, is it I? Lord, is it I? He says, it's the person who sups their bread with me, who dips their bread into the soup. And the figure that's reaching for the soup bowl, just as Christ reaches out for it as well, is this shadowy figure here, and this is most certainly Judas, his face cast entirely in shadow, unlike all of the other apostles whose faces are in the light, and certainly uglier than the figures around him, especially the fair figure of St. John directly next to him here. Those are certainly meant to be opposites of each other, the evil Judas about to betray Christ, and the ever-faithful St. John the Evangelist. Well, in 1498, the forces of the French king invade the Duchy of Milan, where Leonardo has been working for the Duke of Milan. And Leonardo moves back to his hometown of Florence, where he paints the Mona Lisa. This is discussed further in one of the art fixtures online. Toward the end of his life, Leonardo eventually became the court painter to the King of France, King Francis I. His father was the one who had defeated the Duke of Milan, and you would think that Leonardo would have it in for the kings of France, but he doesn't. He has no real investment in politics. But when he moves from Florence to Milan, to France, he takes Lisa Gherardini with him. Never gives it over to her husband, who probably commissioned it. And the question has always been why, but this is also why we call it Mona Lisa, my Lisa. And this is exactly why today is, the single biggest tourist draw in the Louvre Museum in Paris, is because it was Leonardo himself who had taken it to France. Moving forward, as we finish up talking about the Renaissance, our second great titan of the Renaissance is Michelangelo, who's a native of Florence, and was working on his famous statue of David at the same time in the same city where Leonardo was painting the Mona Lisa. They knew each other. They would have, as artists, they would have belonged to the same guilds, and they often argue over which was the better art, painting or sculpture. Leonardo would say, a painter is a gentleman, you shouldn't get all dirty, when you're sculpting you get all muddy. Leonardo also argued that you can't sculpt nature, whereas you can paint this wonderful, amazing world around you. Michelangelo argued that you could do the figure in 3 dimensions. He could show it front, back, and sides, which made him almost closer to God in a way, in creating the human form. This was a long-standing argument among Italian artists, a friendly argument of sorts, over which is the better art, sculpture or painting. Michelangelo sees himself primarily as a sculptor, although he also obviously paints. But his great love, his first love, is in fact sculpture. His David follows ancient Roman and Greek prototypes and uses the classical form of contrapposto, where the weight is borne on one leg, the other leg relaxed, one arm flexed, the other arm relaxed, and the relaxed arm and the relaxed leg on opposite sides of each other. He's certainly looking back at works like Polyclitus' Spear-Bearer, but at the same time, there's something about Michelangelo that's easier and more graceful, maybe even more relaxed. Certainly, it's more perfect. The muscles are softer, the transitions between the muscular forms are smoother. The anatomy is absolutely perfect. Michelangelo was friends with Lorenzo de' Medici, the head of the Medici family during his lifetime. And that means he would have known quite well the version of the David that Donatello had done for Lorenzo's grandfather. And if you look at the two works side by side, you can see that the comparison is quite close, especially in the legs, the placement of the feet, especially the placement of David's left leg on your right. He's gotten rid of the head of Goliath, but from the feet to the waist, the pose is incredibly similar. Even the slight sway that you have to the body itself in each of the two is something that Michelangelo has learned from looking at Donatello. He studied his art history, if you will. At the same time, he's made a number of seeming improvements to the work. You'll notice that Michelangelo's David it removes all the details of storytelling almost. All but one, all but the sling. So he doesn't have a helmet, he doesn't have war boots, he doesn't have a sword. There's no head of Goliath here. All we have is the sling draped over his shoulder and what appears to be a rock in his hand. Right? I'm not so sure there is one there. The bit that we see between the thumb and the finger might be enough just to hold the hand together without having to break apart. But he appears to be holding his hand in the way that maybe does have that rock or the other end of the sling. But in any event, what Michelangelo has done is he's removed all of the details of narrative. And what that means is that with Donatello's David, we know exactly where we are in the story. He has knocked Goliath down with one stone, gone up, and then cut off his head, and this is the moment where he's standing proudly over his victory. With Michelangelo's David, it's not so clear what part of the story it is. Is he sizing up Goliath as he rises over the hill? Is he looking at what happened after having knocked him down and wondering whether he needs to sling him again? It's impossible to tell the exact moment in the story. And I think this is an element of this totally mature high Renaissance, is that for Michelangelo, it becomes sort of more perfected because we can't lock it down to a single moment. It exists for all time. Now, Donatello was a particular hero of Michelangelo's. He loved his work. And growing up in Florence, he would have been familiar with all of these works in public spaces, like the St. Mark on Orsa and Michele. And I think this is even sort of a closer parallel than the Medici David by Donatello, in that it's almost as if Michelangelo's David is a nude version of Donatello's St. Mark. And there are other elements, I think, that recall St. Mark. One of the things we talked about with Donatello is how he is able to give these stone figures a sense of inner life, and how with the changing light, the expression that St. Mark has seems to change. That Donatello is very aware of how to manipulate sculptures so that it has a sense of changing inner vitality. Michelangelo's David does very much the same thing. From different points of view, the figure looks either utterly determined or somewhat reluctant and doubtful of his own power. And I think this really does come from his study of Donatello, his understanding of the effects Donatello was able to achieve. Now remember that Michelangelo's David, while it may recall Donatello and then make us think of Donatello's David, his David is not at all connected to the Medici family. By the time he begins working on this in 1501, the Medici had been thrown out of town again. Lorenzo had been banished from Florence. simply because they didn't feel that they should have dictatorial leaders. Not that Lorenzo was a dictator, but that's what his enemies called him. And after having chucked the Medici out of town, the city commissions their own David to do the Medici version one better. Because remember that David had always been the symbol of Florence. And with Michelangelo's David, the city is sort of taking the symbol back. The Medici had co-opted it inside their palace, but now the city is saying, this is ours. We are David. And they commissioned Michelangelo for exactly that reason. Originally, the statue was going to go on the cathedral in Florence, and you can see in the deep background here, just there, is a fiberglass version of it that was put up a few years back to commemorate, I believe it was the 500th anniversary of this work. And as you might imagine, where it was originally placed, it was almost out of sight. And so that promise changed pretty quickly. But because it was on the cathedral in Florence, that means that the primary group that sponsored the David was the Wool Merchants Guild, who you remember were the sponsors of all major works on the cathedral in Florence, including the doors of the baptistry, which are just out of frame in this picture off to the right. What's particularly fascinating about Michelangelo's David is that this commission for a David had been floating around Florence for about 25 years. And they had originally given the commission to another artist before Michelangelo burst on the scene, who had started carving a massive block of marble to go up on that buttress. And here's a better picture of it, right, up above the city of Florence. Another artist had begun to work on this 25 years earlier and had left it unfinished. And so when the commission finally went to Michelangelo, he took a block of marble that somebody else had already started to rough out and was still able to find within that block this incredible figure of David. Now, once it was done, they decided that it's way too big. It's over 6 tons. To go up on the top of the cathedral in Florence, it would be sort of obscured there and somewhat out of sight. They wanted a more prominent place for it. And so they decided instead to put it just outside the door to City Hall. The Plaza della Signoria in the main square of Florence is where the city council met, and David stood directly outside the door of this to guard their deliberations. Now, it's not there anymore. There's a copy of it in that place because he's been attacked a few too many times, so they threw a bench at him at one point. Broke off his left arm. So these days he's in the museum in Florence, and there's really almost no way to gauge the size of this thing. There's a bunch of people at the time it was being restored with scaffolding that gives you a sense of scale. You stand about the size of his forearm, maybe his shin alone is human size. The size that you would come up to his kneecaps if you stood on the pedestal next to him. This is something you forget because the proportions are all so perfect that he almost loses any sense of scale. Now, Michelangelo's career continues for quite a while after the David. In fact, he lives for another 50 years or so. And his career takes a turn almost immediately. In 1505, shortly after completing the David, the Pope Julius II, summoned Michelangelo to come to Rome to work on his tomb, and then eventually puts him to work on other things like the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And all of this is discussed in one of the art fixes online, Michelangelo's work for Pope Julius in Rome. We're going to turn to the last of the 3 great artists who is active in Florence at the same time as Leonardo and Michelangelo, and this is Raphael. Raphael was born outside Florence, in fact quite a ways outside Florence, and moved to the center of art production during the same time that Leonardo and Michelangelo were there, and had to find himself a niche, if you will, within this somewhat crowded art market. And he paints about 15, maybe 20 images of the Virgin Mary and Christ child in the short span of time that he's in Florence. It seems to be in many ways his specialty. He does other things as well, portraits and whatnot. But he does enough of the that he's trying to develop a niche market of devotional images of the Virgin and Child. And in both of these images, we see quite a bit of influence coming from other artists whose works he had encountered. In particular, while he's in Florence, the single greatest influence on his art is Leonardo da Vinci. And I think if we look at the Madonna in the Meadow in Vienna, Austria, we see, in fact, the impact of Leonardo's works, the way in which the different figures are knitted together in a sort of pyramid in the landscape, derives from Leonardo. But at the same time, it doesn't have any of the mystery, none of the sfumato that Leonardo has. There's no doubt which infant is which. The Baptist is on the left with his little twig cross. Jesus in the center, taking it up, the Madonna's hands around him. Leonardo, you can see, he played with this tradition by putting the hand of the Madonna around the Baptist instead of Christ. But Raphael's is simpler, if you will, more straightforward. And that simplicity, that straightforwardness, the ability to understand it quickly and easily, is picked up by the fact that it has none of that smoky darkness that Leonardo liked so very much. But the figures themselves are very much like Leonardo's figures. In particular, that large figure of the Madonna, which actually quotes another Leonardo almost directly. Well, in 1508, Raphael is also summoned by the Pope to come to Rome, Pope Julius II. He's probably the single most important art patron for the Italian Renaissance. He really gathers together the greatest minds in all of Italy to work for him in Rome. As it was, he just sort of, what do you want to say, he always harvests the Renaissance out of Florence and drags it down to Rome. Down in Rome, Raphael continues to make images of the Virgin and Child, and you can see the one in the National Gallery, the largest one in the National Gallery, is almost an exact reworking of the Madonna in the Meadow. So he continues to employ his trade, if you will, while he's in Rome. He moves in 1508. There are certain similarities in subject matter. In each one of them, the Madonna is seated on a mound of earth. This is to show her humility, and she dominates the landscape behind her. She really dominates the composition, rising well above the horizon line, filling the foreground. The horizon steps gently into a sort of atmospheric perspective in the background, but no drama, no storms, no darkness, or anything like that. On her lap, or near her lap, is Christ. He is literally seated on her lap in the Alba Madonna, whereas he's taking his first steps away from her lap in the Madonna in the Meadow. In each of these, he moves toward John the Baptist, his older cousin, and you'll notice in each one of them, he takes in his hand that cross that John the Baptist bears. This is certainly intended symbolically. This is the moment when Christ is assuming his legacy, if you will, assuming his fate, and taking his first steps toward what will be his eventual death. And the Virgin, whose job it is to protect him, is torn in a certain way, although Raphael's not big into deep emotion. They have a sweetness to them. But, her job is at once to protect her son, but also to be faithful to his mission. And his mission is to take up the cross, to die for the sins of mankind. And so these are very tender images of the moment when Christ leaves the protection of his mother's lap and moves toward what must be his eventual fate. Otherwise, why is he born? Here's a close-up of the Baptist there, those distant civilization in the background, and Christ reaching over, looking toward his cousin, and receiving his fate. Finally, since this was done in Rome, one of the things we see happening to Raphael's works in Rome is that while elements of Leonardo's influence still remain, not the sfumato, but just sort of some of the figure elements, the flowing of the drapery and whatnot, he injects into that, on getting to Rome, a more enhanced influence from Michelangelo. In particular, the figures on the Sistine ceiling seem to form the basis for his conception of the Virgin Mary in the Alba Madonna in the National Gallery. They have the same strength and monumentality and burliness that Michelangelo's do. They're maybe not quite as muscular as Michelangelo's ladies are, but at the same time they do dominate the space around them. We know that Raphael was very much influenced by Michelangelo because he and Michelangelo are both working for the Pope at the same time. Raphael has the second largest painting commission after the Sistine ceiling for a series of private rooms for the Pope, which are discussed in one of the art fixes. But in this image, he includes this little portrait of Michelangelo here, disguised as Heraclitus, the philosopher from ancient Greece. But the pose there is also based on these Sistine ceiling figures, as is the Alba Madonna.